Welcome to the SYA podcast, giving you teachings from the young adult ministry of Shepherd Church, where it is our mission to lift up Christ that the world might believe. We meet every Thursday at Shepherd Church in Porter Ranch. For more info, go to wearesya.com.
Is there anybody here that that was their first time to hear or sing the song that we just sang, The Run to the Father? Anybody first time to hear it? Just me? That was my first time to hear that song. And it was a terrible song to sing right before I come up and preach and not know it. It was all kinds of messing me up. Wonderful song. It's a wonderful song, but terrible to have to keep from crying right before you come up to... this is a tangent, sorry. Hopefully it'll be good. But I was super close to my dad. And you guys have been coming here for a long time. You've heard me tell lots of stories about my dad. Very easy for me at 18 when I came to Jesus and I heard in the church talk about God as Father. It was very easy for me to say, oh, well, that's a good thing. Because my dad was my guy, my hero. He's been dead for 10 years now, died of cancer. Just a couple months, less than 2 months after Silas was born. We gave Silas his middle name of my dad. But I have all these memories of like hugging my dad. And like 7th grade, my dog died, and I was being a cool guy and trying to go to this 8th grader party, get a girlfriend, and act like I didn't care. And then my dad followed me to the door, and I like turned around and just exploded and hugged my dad. And that's what I was thinking about when I was singing this song. Because when I think of the Father, I think of something like my dad, only way bigger, way better. And I know some of you didn't have a dad like mine. And so maybe the images that you conjure up are different. But however the Spirit of God works it out in your heart to encourage you that God is your Father and He loves you so much, I hope you receive that. It's a good song. It's a good song. Just stupid to sing it for the first time. I didn't know right before preaching. Well, hey, one other. This isn't a tangent. This one's planned, but so we used to like record, like video record, whatever it's called. I don't know. Video our sermons and put them on YouTube, and so we just kind of stopped doing that, which I love. Because like it's one thing to say a lot of stupid stuff. It's another thing to have those out on the internet where people can see you say it. So now we just record the audio, and we started a podcast, and it's real easy to like know what to look for because it's called the SYA podcast. So if you're like, hey, what's the SYA podcast called? Yes, right? The SYA podcast. There's only one on there right now from 2 weeks ago. We didn't actually capture the audio last week, which ended up being a good thing, I think, because today I sat down and I won't tell you everything I say at the beginning of it about how I even figured out how to record on my laptop because of my 15-year-old, and he gave me a really cool mic that he had, and it actually sounds pretty good. But I just made it like an actual podcast, and hopefully you'll like it. I think it's probably more conversational, even though I don't think I have a big-time preachy voice. I think I sound the same as when I talk and get really excited, but maybe not. Or you'll listen to it, and maybe you'll hate it. And you'll be like, dude, don't do any more podcasts. Cool. Like, either way, you can check that out. Jeff's going to drop the one I did today just in my office tomorrow when he does this one right now. So you'll have two if you're a podcast addict like me, and you do like to listen to a lot of podcasts. That's kind of what we have for you. But one thing I thought we'd try is we've had this like Google voice text number for a long time. I'll have it here on the screen. And we've used it for different things, different Q&As and panels and things we've done. But I thought one thing, this series, which I'm really excited about, because who isn't excited to talk about God's will in your life and in your future? But like, there's no way we'll cover everything that we could talk about and in just a few weeks. And so I thought, well, this would be cool. We got this podcast thing. We could try this and see what happens. So if you have a question at some point, maybe some things in this message pique a specific question you have, going on in your life, it's all anonymous. The people on staff, we have that Google Voice app on our phone, and so we get those texts, but we've made a commitment to each other. We don't sync them to our contacts, so even if I were to have your phone number with your name on my phone, it will not come up under your name. I would have to do a lot of work to find out who it is, and I just don't have that kind of time. Nobody's going to want to do that, right? So it is anonymous. That doesn't mean you can still put your name if you want, if you think that'd be fun, if it's specific, great. But what I thought, if there's enough questions plus questions that make sense to me to try to talk through on a 30-minute podcast, I may just try to do that. Take some of your questions based on some of this stuff and try to do one of those next week. So we'll see. That's kind of up to you all. It's no pressure. It's an experiment. Now for tonight. I've never gone to a fortune teller. I don't know if you have. I have not. I did have a very close relative of mine, because I always figured fortune telling, even as a non-believer, I just thought it was a scam. Like, it made more psychological sense to me that some people are good at poker and other people are good at reading us, with a few questions. So I believed it was a scam, but I had a really close family member, and when she was in college, her and her friends messed with the Ouija board, right? And she claims that they asked the Ouija board a question, something like, is anybody going to get hurt? And it spelled out Susanna. This is one of this person's friends. And they asked how she was going to get hurt, and it just spelled car, right? And then just like 3 days later, Susanna was in a car wreck, right? So my family member said to me, it's demonic, right? I'm never messing with that again. And I don't know who does. I don't know if there's spirits, demonic spirits involved and things like that. But I do think that part of how those kinds of things work is suggestion. Because our mind, now this is just true, whether or not it's connected to that stuff or not, it is true that our minds, the human mind, loves to find meaning and patterns even among random data, random things going on. And this can get pretty magnified when you take that truth about how our minds work and you put it in a religious context. It gets really magnified. Two very close friends were a husband and wife driving, praying about possibly going to a certain country to become missionaries. And when all of a sudden, as they tell the story, all of a sudden they got behind this truck, and in the back of the bed of the truck there was a flashing, blinking neon light with and the light was the name of the country that they were praying about going to. And they were like, it's a sign. And I think this is kind of like what's called pareidolia. I'm not sure if I pronounced it right, but it's the phenomenon of seeing patterns in random data. Like, and it covers several different things. Like when you see an image in the clouds, right? And you're convinced that, oh my God. And like Asher does this all the time. And he'll be like, Dad, and he'll describe it. And I'll look at it and go, yeah, looks like circles and puff smoke. I don't see it. He's like, how can you not see it? Right? And you see Jesus in the pancake, or Mother Mary, or whatever the different, phenomena is. Or we find the sign of what we already want, or the bad news that we assume is coming, we find it. We talked a little bit about this last week. This is confirmation bias theory. Now, the question could be asked, if that seems to be how a lot of us are wired, can God use that? Yes, of course. But it begs a couple questions. If we use confirmation bias to subconsciously find what we already believe, what we already fear might happen, or what we already want to happen, how does that confirm God's will? Or a second question, if this becomes our process, if we're not maybe superstitious, just like Michael Scott, a little stitious, if this is our process, how will we ever know God's will when it's not connected to what we already want, fear, or believe? When it might actually be random? And while we may not go to a fortune teller, I think a lot of people want the Bible to be like a Ouija board or a magic 8-ball, seeking like a step-by-step or a map, right? Or an acronym. You heard this one? Bible. basic instructions before leaving earth, right? It's just, we kind of want it like that. And I think if we're honest, maybe some of you, I think a lot of people, the reason they pray, if they're honest, at least one of the big reasons they pray or attend church regularly or read scripture, because like all people, they've made some bad decisions, like all of us. They're uncertain, they're anxious about the future. They've watched their parents go through hell on earth because of certain decisions. And so maybe they do this, they kind of go to the religious crystal ball methods, hoping God will just tell them what to do. He'll direct their path. He'll a light from the sky, but maybe coming up out of the book of the Bible, right? And then it just like lays it out for you like a yellow brick road. And I think some religious folks make it worse for us, whether they mean to or not. They seem really close to God, and maybe they are really close to God. And then some of these people say things like, God directed me to this, or God told me that, or he kept me from choosing this bad mistake. And again, first of all, you talk about your relationship with God however you want, and I'll do the same for me. I'm not talking about whether that's right or wrong, honestly. But it can make it really difficult for some people who are looking to the Bible, looking to prayer, looking for church attendance, kind of like rubbing a crystal ball, hoping God just lights the way in every single step of the journey. When they hear people that seem really close to God, and maybe they are, talk like that, it can become even more. And so you might even say like, oh yeah, I've heard that before and it's really weird, bro, but I kind of wish I had some of that. I wish God would speak to me like that. Let's be honest, we all want direction. Divine direction, I think. Like we all want that. We want a meaningful life. And I think that we often worry, religious or not, that we're going to mess it up or at least not choose the best path. And therein lies, I think, next to all the constant connectedness of our culture, what I just described, therein lies so much anxiety. Because not much is settled after high school anymore. I would argue not much is settled after college or several years after high school if you don't go to college. Life is wide open, right? Endless possibilities. And the more possibilities, like I love options. I just do. I'm an American modern person, right? I love options. But I also, I don't think this has to do with age either. You know what I also like? I like it when the options are simplified and they become a little more narrow, because then it creates less anxiety, right? Because I have a little bit of obsessive compulsive personality. Like if I want something really bad, I research it way too long. Sometimes I research it so long I don't even want it anymore, right? I'm like, I don't know. And I'll bookmark this one, I'll think about it later, and I'll do this, and I'll just give me a couple options is how I feel sometimes, right? Life is wide open. And that kind of confusion and anxiety that comes with all the possibilities can bring in temptation to freeze us up, or for us to make excuses, or to procrastinate. With everything I could do, how do I know what I should do? That's a way to break it down. What is God's will for my life for this summer? What should my major be? Now that I've been in college for 2.5 years, right? I don't know. What should my major be? What career should I go into? Do I want a career? I've talked to all kinds of young adults who don't have a vision of not having a career, but working different jobs to make just enough money to do the adventures they want to do. I don't judge that. It just kind of sounds cool, right? Or do I want a career? What kind of career? Should I get married? To whom? Do I want kids? How many kids? What about grad school? What temporary job should I work now before the career that I don't know yet? What kind of savings account? Should I get in the money market? What kind? What kind of retirement? Some of you are in jobs now and they're already talking to you about retirement and you're like, bro, I'm 22, right? But I remember that. Retirement? I'm not gonna retire. Old people retired. I'm never getting old. And now I'm like, crap, right? If God has a wonderful plan for my life, how can I discover what it is? And more importantly, what if I miss it? What if I mess it up? Let me ask you another question. What if we have a difficult time discovering God's mysterious plan for our lives because he never intended to tell us about it ahead of time anyway? Don't take that to the bank. I'm not saying that's God said so, but what if? What I would argue is that God's will, this phrase and whatever it means, is confusing, even if some people talk like they've got it figured out. It's like people that talk like they understand the Trinity. What? You don't understand? I still think it's true, just like I believe in God's will. And it's confusing. Some people speak of God's will as all things happening according to his will. For other people, it's all about being obedient and doing God's will. And then there's a third way that people talk about God's will. That's the way most people are thinking of when they're talking about God's will. But before that, I want to look at the first two because I think they kind of make up two sides biblically of the will of God. The first is what I'm calling God's will as determined. The idea here is that everything God ordains or determines will come to pass. That's biblical. The theological idea here is that what God wills will happen. Another word that's usually used in connection with this side of God's will is God's sovereignty. Let me read from the scriptures, Ephesians chapter 1, verse 11. In him we were also made heirs, having been predestined according to the plan of him who works out everything in conformity with the purpose of his will. Matthew 10. This is from Jesus. Are not two sparrows sold for a penny, yet not one of them will fall to the ground outside of your Father's will or foreknowledge. And even the very hairs of your head are numbered. Isaiah 46. I am God, and there is no other. I am God, and there is none like me. I make known the end from the beginning, from ancient times, what is still to come. I say, my purpose will stand, and I will do all that I please. And it's really easy for some of us to go down the rabbit hole here of what all this might mean or imply. And I think there is plenty of space for interpretation when it comes to the will of God in the scriptures, for how you work all that out. Like, does God determine how life and creation works in general? Like he determines that, and then occasionally he specifically intervenes? That, I don't know if that's my view, but my view is something close to that. Because I'm just as honest as I can be about this. I'm pretty confused about God's sovereignty. I kind of think we should be, by the way. But it's something like that view. And this view, like God determines how life and creation works in general, and then occasionally, specifically intervenes. Because there's also this thing called free will, but I'm getting ahead of myself. This view is probably more comfortable with the idea that God does not cause every single event ahead of time. I gotta think of what I'm trying to say here. And allows each choice. Let me read it. And this view is probably more comfortable with the idea that God doesn't cause everything. I missed the but. Stupid jokes in my head. This view is probably more comfortable with the idea that God doesn't cause everything, but he knows ahead of time and allows every choice and circumstance that happens. Somewhere close to what I biblically believe. But there's plenty of people far smarter than I, some of you, and maybe even most religious people, I don't know, they see God's sovereignty as God causing every single event, but like a puzzle, he had it all mapped out. And it'll make sense, at least to him and maybe to us someday in the next life. Maybe. I think the entire reality of God's will and sovereignty is a mystery and it's confusing. Like, consider this. There's people in both of those camps. They're equally passionate about their view and they use the same scriptures to prove their point against the opposing point that's using the same scriptures to prove their point to the opposing point. It's kind of like confirmation bias. Yeah? You'll probably find what you are looking for. And I think that's okay. However you work it all out, the Bible shows a side of God's will, however you work it out, as determined, knowing all, and sovereignly overseeing all things. God's will is determined. And second, the other side, God's will as our duty. God has commanded things of human beings. His will as determined is how things are. This is just, I think what we can know. His will as determined is how things are. His will as duty is how things ought to be. Here's some examples in the scriptures. God's will as our duty. 1 John chapter 2. Do not love the world or anything in the world. If anyone loves the world, love for the Father is not in them. For everything in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, comes not from the Father, but from the world. The world and its desires pass away, but whoever does the will of God lives forever. Matthew chapter 7, Jesus, he says, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. So these passages, they don't speak to the way God has ordained or determined things, but how he commands us to live. And we have freedom to choose to obey or disobey. So there's a paradox when it comes to God's will, because the Bible affirms both God's sovereignty and our responsibility. It's a paradox. These two colliding truths that still remain true at the same time. There's tension. God is sovereign, but he didn't design sin, but he allowed for the possibility. We're under his sovereignty, but we're responsible for our actions. And the passage that came to mind that comes, I think, is close to merging these two truths is Deuteronomy chapter 29. Moses speaking to the people of Israel. 29:29. He says, the secret things. The literal Hebrew here is the things that are concealed. The secret concealed things belong to the Lord our God, but the things that are revealed belong to us and to our children forever, that we may follow all the words of this law. God has things known. There are certain things that are known only to him. I think that's what this passage is saying. There's certain things known only to him. And possibly because even if he tried to make it known to us, that our time, space, limited brains couldn't even comprehend it, possibly. But there are things that he has revealed that we are meant to know and obey. All right, God's will is determined and as our duty. Here's the third way of talking about God's will that most people are concerned with. And it's God's will as direction. Our questions about the future, college, career, marriage, money, whatever else. What we're really saying is, what is God's specific direction for me in this specific thing, this specific choice, specific question? So let me lay it out simply as a question. Does God have a secret, concealed will of direction that he expects me to figure out before I move forward? No. I do not believe he does. I do believe that God is sovereign. And as Romans chapter 8, verse 28 says, that God works all things together for the good of those who love him. That works all things together. The Greek word is, the way it's pronounced is synergeo, but it's where we got our English word synergy. That you're taking all these elements that are different, but and they each have energy and mass and power in and of themselves, but when you put them together, there's more there. That God can take the good, the bad, and all in between that he has allowed, and in Christ, he can actually use them for good, for his kingdom. And I believe that in retrospect, in looking back, that we will often be able to trace God's hand in bringing us to where we are now. That's what I think. I think Joseph in the Bible is the best example for this. His brothers sold him into slavery to Egypt. He was accused of rape, put in prison, but because of his solid character, He was elevated time and again until ultimately he was Pharaoh, who was the king of Egypt, but the ruler of really the known world at the time, the most powerful. He became his right-hand man. And he ends up saving all of Egypt, Joseph does, and all of the nearby world, including his family, from a terrible famine. And 25 years after having been sold into slavery, Joseph's whole family, including his brothers, come to live with him in Egypt, and his brothers fear that after their dad dies, Joseph's gonna kill us because we sold him into slavery. What if he's just being cool because, Pop is still alive? And what about when Pop dies? He's gonna kill us. And then in Genesis chapter 50, Joseph finds out his brothers fear this. And with 25 years of retrospect, of being able to look back, he says this, Genesis chapter 50, verse 20, to his brothers, you intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. I think it's fine, obviously, because you have your free will and I'm wrong about a lot of things. So I know you're like, thanks for permission. I think it's fine when people talk in the moment of what's going on that hasn't even like played out yet. They're like, it is God's will for me to, and this very specific thing. It's your life, right? But Joe wasn't saying this when he was being sold into slavery or when he was in prison accused of rape. He wasn't like, this is just God's determined will. And yet, do you ever notice that a lot of people find a lot of confidence in what God's will is when it's something they already want? When it's something they already fear is going to happen anyway? What if we relied a little more? What if we moved forward differently and relied on confidence more in retrospect? While I think Scripture teaches that God isn't confused or weak, right? He's God. I think he's sovereign. I think he can work all things together for ultimate good. While I believe all that, I do not believe that God assigns us a lifelong homework assignment of solving an absurd puzzle called his will. I think God cares about your future deeply, more than us. I think he helps you find wisdom. Jeff's gonna preach an entire sermon about that. And I believe that God directs our path. I believe this. But how mean would it be if God's will was really a maze or a tightrope or a bullseye, and God was like, you got one shot to figure it out. Good luck, kid. Like, do you run to that father or are you mad at that father, right? Trusting God's will as determined is good. God's in control. God is sovereign. God knows all things from beginning to end, which is very different than causing, would be my argument. Following God's will as duty is obedience, but waiting for God's will as perfect direction is a mess. This is my 22 years of experience as a pastor in trying to help pace with people. If this is how it was designed, life would be more about puzzle solving than character building. And I don't think that's what life is about. I think life's about character building, not puzzle solving. So the big takeaway is searching frantically for the next perfectly hidden divine step in our journey only stirs up more anxiety. And it usually leads religious people to ask this question as they're trying to decide. As they're almost ready to make a decision, they say, but what if it's not God's will? Oh, man. This can be paralyzing, causing many of us to be passive and lazy and cowardly. Because if we're honest, most of the time when we're asking, but is this God's will? It has nothing to do with morals. Because those are usually really easy. Is it God's will for me that I, spend the night at my girlfriend's house? Is it God's will? Is this God's will? See, I'm making fun of that because it's easy. I'm not saying it's easy in your flesh. I'm not saying it's easy in your desire, but morally, you're talking about God's will when it comes to that. Should I, even after I'm 21 and I'm legal to drink, should I get drunk Is this God's will for my, no, it's the Bible clearly says, like I'm making fun of that because you don't talk about God's, well, you shouldn't. It's silly to talk about God's will when it comes to your morality. But what about the other stuff? I think often when we get to that place of anxiety, if we're looking at God's will as a maze and a tightrope, and where's the next, oh gosh, what if I mess it up? What if I don't, why won't God open it, shake it up, 8 ball, what do you ask the Bible? What is it gonna tell me to do? This leads to being passive and lazy and cowardly. And this is not how God has made us. So I wanna talk in this series about seeking God's will, about wisdom, about hearing from God. But mostly I want to inspire and challenge you to move and do something. Tonight is really more of an invitation to think about God's will, maybe differently than you had. But ultimately, God's specific will for you isn't about decisions you'll make. Ultimately, God's specific will for you is about the person you're becoming. Not the decisions you're making. I know they're connected. I get that. But when we face everything on each choice, what's God's magic will versus the choices we're making of who we're becoming, it's a very different ballgame. But I do want to leave you with some, I didn't want to just end the sermon there, so I do want to just throw out what I think are some very simple action steps, very general, and yet they never get old. This is what I want to throw out to you, give to you, offer to you as you lean into this week, thinking about God's will and guidance. Ask God for wisdom. Jeff's going to do a whole sermon on that, so I thought I would put it out there now. Like, seek God for wisdom, right? James chapter 1, verse 5. If anyone is without wisdom and needs wisdom, ask God. He's generous to all, and he'll give it. Seek God for wisdom. Search the scriptures to see if there's anything in the scriptures that relate to your specific decision and issue. And now again, I understand confirmation bias. We tend to find it on every page, in every worship song, and in every sermon because we're thinking about it. But if you can get yourself in a place that's focused, well, let me give you an example. When I was a new Christian, I was advised to use the concordance in the back of my study Bible that my dad gave me to look up something I was dealing with, look up a word, look every time that word was used in the Bible that I was interested in or thinking a lot about. You wanna know what mine was? Fear. But you know why that was the word? Because at 15, 16, 17, and 18, I was deeply insecure, even though everyone around me would have thought deeply confident, right? And I was afraid. I didn't even know all the things I was afraid of. And I devoured every verse I could find in the Bible about fear and insecurities. And in doing so, God probably spoke to my heart in a lot of different ways about what I was thinking about in moving forward. The first full book of the Bible I ever read was an Old Testament book called Ecclesiastes. The youth pastor that was mentoring me after I came to the Lord, he said, hey man, you should read Ecclesiastes. You like to philosophize and all this. You should read it. And I'm like, okay. And I went home and I read all 12 chapters. I still have some of it in memory from the first time I read it. That's how profoundly it affected me. And that one I wasn't even looking for. I mean, unless you think subconsciously I was once I got there, oh. But it spoke. You search the scriptures. And then solicit the wise. People that you think are wise in your life, that are godly and wise. Solicit them. Hey, I'm going through this. What's wise counsel? And Proverbs says, you're wise if you take the advice and heed the warnings of wise, godly people. So ask for wisdom. 2, just do something. Maybe you could put good in there, right? Like something godly. Something. Move. Often asking, what if it isn't God's will? I think often that is simply an excuse to avoid risk, difficulty, and to procrastinate. If we're honest. Here's a timely example for some of you. You may say, I don't know what to do career-wise, right? And I think there are some practical ways to assess that, right? That wise people could sit with you and help you assess that. But generally speaking, I would say something like, I don't know what I should do career-wise. That's okay. Most people don't at this age. And many of those who do know what they want to do, they end up, I wouldn't say most, but many change. They change their career. I don't think it's the majority, but there are enough people my age that it's like common that the degree they had or have is their job that they've had the last 15 years has nothing to do with that. That happens. That's okay. Like that's normal. Part of being an adult who's owning your life and growing in character is to do something, to not be paralyzed by the fact that there are possibilities, multiple possibilities. What you can do is put together a plan with as much disciplined thinking as you're able, and then figure out what's one good step in that plan, and then I'll see what happens. I know that's super frustrating. I get it. But here's some like sage adult advice. It doesn't change because of age. That's always there. I think it's very intense at this age. I remember, because it's all before you, right? I mean, what's behind is childhood, right? So like so the pressure, man, and a lot of that's not your fault. Like, I'm not making an excuse. I'm saying a lot of the pressure is cultural. Like, it's put on you. And sadly, that's caused me to want to put even more pressure on some of you, because by being pressured by culture, some of you have just been kind of like, whatever, right? And like you don't do much of anything that's responsible or adult. And it's like this idea of adulting is silly, and so it makes me want to go, no. There's part of adulthood that's like not awesome, but when you're an adult, you should be an adult, right? And if people like me can't prove that you can still be like an adult and silly, right? And have a lot of fun and still have joy, right? But like, no. Adulthood is good, and adulthood's not having it figured out. Adulthood is saying, I got to do something. There's so many options, and I've got a lot of anxiety, and I don't know how it's all going to work out, and I wish I could shake the Bible up like a magic 8-ball, and God would just tell me, but that doesn't seem, he seems to be more interested in who I'm becoming than exactly what I choose. So what is one step? What if I narrowed it down from 5 things to 3? And then what if I narrowed it down to 2? And then what if I and what if I what if I meet with this person who does that and meet with this person who does that? And as you keep making steps, you're making progress. Moses and the Jewish people, they leave Egypt in slavery. This is some 400 years after Joseph. And he leads the slaves out of Egypt. But when they see Pharaoh and his army, they change their mind, and they're coming and they're going to take them back as slaves. The Israelites freak out. And in Exodus chapter 14, verse 10, it says, as Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up, and there were the Egyptians marching after them. They were terrified, and they cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? What have you done to us, bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you while we were in Egypt, leave us alone, let us serve the Egyptians? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert. And then in verse 13, Moses says, don't be afraid, stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring to you today. The Lord will fight for you. You only need to be still. And the music started right then. It was like epic, right? Like, like epic music, right? And like people got goosebumps, and it was a sermon, and be still and know that and then in the very next verse, God speaks to Moses in verse 15, and I love it. And part of it is because I already think like this, so I find these kind of verses, and I like it. So there you go, right? We all got the confirmation bias. God says, then the Lord said to Moses, why are you crying out to me? Tell the Israelites to move. Where? There's a big body of water called an ocean right there, right? And the the Egyptians are there coming after him. And God says, why are you crying? Shut up. That's not in the Hebrew. Move. We find out in verse 21 of chapter 14 that God stirred the wind all night and eventually parts the Red Sea for them to escape. But of course, they couldn't have known that. And God didn't tell them. He didn't tell Moses either. They cry out. God doesn't tell them what he's going to do, but he also doesn't say, but it's okay. Sit back. Chill. Be still and know. Because there is a time for that. But evidently it wasn't that time, even though Moses told him to. God's like, no, don't be still. Move. While the uncertainties and mysteries are real, some of the best advice when it comes to your future is just do something. Something good, something godly, yes. But just move. Just do something. Take the next good step. Take a good step. Ask a good, wise, godly person, what is a good next step I should do in this specific thing? Before I give you this last one, and we close and move into a time of response, I want to throw up the Google Voice text number one more time. So if you want to hit that up, we'll see what I can. It'll be impromptu also. Like when I read I'm not going to read them, write out my responses, because that's more fun, right? And it also provides more opportunity for entertainment to where I might say something that I'm a verbal processor when I don't have notes. So I'm not actually sure what I think. I find out as I talk. And sometimes I get done for 3 minutes and go, actually, I don't know that I believe in that. And that'll just be more fun. Here's my last action step I want to give you. As you lean in this week thinking about God's guidance, God's will. Obsess over present character, not over problematic choices. There's room to be obsessive in the kingdom of God. One of those things should be over your character. Obsess. It's everything. Set up boundaries. Make commitments. If you need to go overboard for a season, go overboard. Not over problematic choices. I wanted to give you something personal. When I was 24, I'd been a youth pastor for 2 years. That I ended up being there for 8 years, but I'd been a youth pastor for 2 years, young married guy. We were at a church of about 350 people, a little smaller than this church. This church is about 12,000. There were not a whole lot more people at the whole church than there are here tonight. I had about 30 students that I was the youth pastor over. And 2 years in, I was 24, a church of 15,000 in Texas called. And there were some leaders at that church in their youth ministry that my wife and I both loved and respected, and they asked us to come. And I wanted to go. I loved the idea for a lot of reasons. And we prayed, and we had no epiphanies. I learned real early that God does not speak to my heart the way he seems to speak to others very clearly. That I have to wrestle and work and then make a decision is how it tends to. But I will, well, now I'm getting ahead of myself, sorry. But we ultimately decided to stay at that church because we felt, and here's how we decided. We felt like a lot of young youth pastors would leave smaller churches after they'd only been there for a little while. And it seemed like, and I was making a judgment, and maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I was wrong then, maybe wrong now. But it seemed like they were doing it because it was bigger and better. They all connected it to God's will, and who am I to judge that? But it was God's will in youth pastors leaving seemed often to be connected after they'd been there a very short time at a smaller church, in a smaller community. God's will seemed to always take them somewhere bigger. And they also got paid more. And I was worried that I might be doing that. And whether those other people did it or not, that obviously that's between them and God. But I was just worried that might be, and Amy was right there with me. And so we didn't go. We stayed. And about 2 years later, I got a call from the largest Christian church in the country about being their middle school pastor. This was a really quick phone call. I wish I could do it over again, not to take the job, but just this poor guy that called me. I said, how many middle school kids are in that ministry? He said 1,000. I said, how many adults? He said hundreds. I was like, bro, I would mess it up so bad. I wouldn't even know how to start, right? He laughed, right? He laughed. He's like, so can we get you out here for an interview? And I was like, did you not hear what I just said? I was being serious. Like, no, thank you. Oh, okay. Thanks, Dusty. Right? Like, I don't know if I processed all of them the right way, but here's what I think. I don't think I would have ended up here had I gone to either one of those. And as I look back, like Joseph, because I've got retrospect now, I've been here 15 years. Amy and I both see in retrospect the hand of God. Like now, I'm comfortable saying, I think God called us to shepherd. I can say that because it's in retrospect. I can look and go, oh, and this and that. But here's also what I think I know. I think we could have gone to either one of those churches and been right in the middle of God's will because of who we were becoming and who we were. I believe that with all my heart. And maybe on the other side of this life, if we can understand it different, maybe I'll be wrong, but I think I'll only be able to understand it like that then because it's on the other side of eternity. And so now, God's specific will isn't about which non-moral choice we'll make. It's about what kind of person we're becoming. So this week, as you lean into thinking about God's will and his guidance for your life, remember, ask God for wisdom, search the scriptures to see what it might say specifically about what you're thinking about or generally, and obsess over your present character, not over problematic choices. That's just what I think. Quite certain I'm wrong about some of it, but I hope that God will use at least a portion of that to encourage you this week, to challenge you this week to do something. I'm going to ask you to stand. I'm going to pray, and my hope is that we each are able to respond in some way to the Lord. Jesus, sorry for any of that I got wrong. Thanks for whatever's good and right about where we were led tonight in thinking about leaning into your will and your guidance. Lord, I think my heart is most set on right now those who feel like they've been paralyzed by indecision for some choices in their life right now. And whether I've got that all worked out correctly or not, I pray, Spirit of God, that you would inspire and encourage their hearts and challenge those that are frozen. God, that you'd challenge them to move like the Israelites. The crying out is fine, especially if they haven't cried out yet. And I know you let us run to you however we are, in whatever manner, but that those who are frozen and overly perplexed and drowning in anxiety, maybe because of the multiplicity of their options, would you push and pull them in the loving way that only you can toward something, some kind of step, some kind of good, godly move forward. And God, would your Spirit also, Brianne was praying earlier as we prayed over this night, she was praying that you would calm our hearts, calm our minds, that you would give us your peace. That Paul wrote, he said that your peace transcends our understanding. So for some in this room, God, I'm asking for the kind of peace that does not make sense, like we can't understand it. We don't work it out rationally and then have peace, but when you give us that kind of peace, it transcends that which we can comprehend or understand. So I pray, God, in the name of Jesus, may your peace be upon us. That whatever we don't know about the decisions we're looking at in front of us, may we know in our bones that Jesus, you are not only here and among us and within us, that you are good, and that you not only died so that our sins would be washed away, but you rose from the dead to give us hope in the life to come, but even more so in the confusion and turmoil of this life here and now. And that even in the midst of uncertainties, you, through the resurrection, you give us joy. So would you mix all that up like a cocktail and move in us, I pray. In your name, Jesus, amen.
Thanks for listening to the SYA podcast. Be sure to connect with us on Instagram at WeAreSYA.